Hello and welcome back to another edition of Mapton School District's Wednesday workshop. Today we are going to continue looking at the idea of finding error in the classroom and building a culture of error so that students feel comfortable expressing where they are struggling, sharing those struggles, and working with teachers and students to improve their thinking. This week's topic is Excavate Error. And if you know anything about excavators, and I know very, very little, but part of their task is to dig holes and to get underneath the surface at varying levels. And today we're going to be looking at the idea that when we are uncovering error, we can do that on a very surface level. We can kind of go a little bit deeper, and then we can go very deep into examining and analyzing that error with our students. Both teacher and student can learn from the mistakes that students make. This is because mistakes are rarely random, but rather are characterized by logical mistakes, and that can reveal the thinking behind them. To fully look at those errors that we and what they can teach us, we have to excavate those errors. By that, I mean analyzing errors with the class to discover and address underlying misconceptions and incorrect thinking. As you can imagine, the depth can vary dramatically depending on the situation. A teacher might choose to engage the class in a very deep, more extensive discussion about the error at one point, and bypass discussion in favor of one-on-one reteaching at another. To better describe the range of approaches and the decision-making that drives them, we're going to look at three of them and the factors that might influence you to use a particular choice. So we're going to be looking at assess and move on, light excavation, and deep excavation. These approaches are kind of like a continuum of sorts, and it reminds us that we can study mistakes in a variety of ways and settings. Sometimes the simplest option works best, and other times a more in-depth approach is best. But as a great teacher, you're going to seek to get the most productive balance between the three of them. So let's get started. The first is assess and move on. In some cases, you may want to make the strategic decision to not study an error at a given point in time in the class and instead push forward with your lesson. For instance, you might opt to check in individually with a student when he or she struggles with a question that everyone else has answered correctly. Or you may identify a couple of students who need additional help, pull them to a side table or into a group, and work with them more one-on-one. So assess and move on is best used when only a few students made the error or the error itself is minor, like a simple miscalculation. Or it's relatively unimportant and not closely related to your lesson objective. So this form of excavation should not be confused with inaction. The question isn't whether or not you will respond to the error, it's when and how. So in this case, you are not going to devote a lot of class time and especially working with the entire class on this error. You're going to be working with just a small group. And that can prevent the rest of your students who have that understanding to not be frustrated and question, why are we going over this again? All right, the next topic is light excavation. So many errors that you're going to encounter kind of surface unexpectedly and require a relatively quick study. If several students make a certain error, or if the error merits a bit of discussion because it's closely related to your learning target or learning objective, and it's important for them to understand, you can consider doing light excavation by having students analyze the positives in a wrong answer. right? So you can say things like, there's a lot of good thinking here, but there's one especially important line right at the end that some of us could have read or even reread more closely, right? So you're just going to analyze it. You're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but as a whole class, you're going to be analyzing those. So some ways that you can do light excavation with your class is ask for an alternative response. So after calling on a student to share his or her answer and discussing it a little bit, you could, without revealing whether the response was correct or incorrect, ask for an alternative. You can compare responses. So instead of looking at an alternative response in a sequence, you could compare them side by side. Okay, let's look at these two. How are they similar? How are they different? Why are these different? And helping to really capture that thinking. You can analyze wrong choices. So ask students to look at the incorrect response and explain why they're wrong, or state the plausible yet faulty reasoning behind them. So, why did people, or why would people give this response? So you can ask for a proposed response. So, this part is really tricky. Where might people get confused, and what would their answer be if they were confused? So really getting them to think about what makes an answer correct and what makes an answer incorrect can really solidify that thinking and that learning for students. And then finally, and most in-depth, of course, is deep excavation. So some errors are so fundamental to the mastery of a lesson or unit that they warrant deeper excavation. In some situations, you might survey a wide variety of possible answers and dig into the various errors, or you might study one incorrect response with unusual depth and thoroughness, asking students to evaluate strengths and areas that need revision. These responses, deep excavation, requires a lot of time. So you're going to want to, again, plan ahead. If you think that students are going to have some significant fundamental errors in your unit of study, reserve that time to go deep in the incorrect answers and the thinking behind them, so that you can look at the most important questions and the most important learning. All right, that was a very quick Wednesday workshop for you. Thank you for joining me. You can, of course, access all of these materials on our Google Classroom. There's some responses here that you can use, and that will help you to form questions, or there's question stems really for the different levels of excavation. You are welcome to use that and, of course, adapt it however you see fit. If you need any help, please feel free to reach out. If you want to discuss this more, I'd be happy to do that. Have a great week, Mabton.